Now that the NBA offseason is pretty much over, we're going to go ahead and do some grades for every single team in the league. How did each of these teams do in the offseason based off their trades, based off their draft, as well as the contracts they handed out this offseason? We begin with one of the most newsworthy teams of the offseason, and that is the Atlanta Hawks. Of course, bringing in DeJounte Murray, they drafted AJ Griffin. You can see who they added and subtracted this offseason. And for me, I'm going to give them a B, which is pretty much how I felt about the DeJounte Murray trade in the first place. And that's obviously the biggest move of their offseason. As much as I think AJ Griffin's going to be solid for them on the wing, the entirety of this offseason depends on how the DeJounte Murray trade works out. And although I think it's a talent upgrade for them, I think they gave up a little bit too much in terms of draft compensation. And I'm a little unsure of how he fits alongside Trae Young, so I'm going to give them a B grade. Next up now is the Boston Celtics. Biggest moves for them where they signed Danilo Gallinari as a free agent, and then they brought in Malcolm Brogdon via a trade, and they didn't give up anybody significant within their rotation, unless you count Aaron Nesmith, and they got significantly better in my opinion. It all depends on if Malcolm Brogdon is healthy for them this year. If he is, he's exactly what they need in the backcourt. I gave them a B+ for their offseason. Next up now is my very own Brooklyn Nets, who unfortunately I had to give an F for their offseason. One of my biggest issues is the fact they let go of Bruce Brown. They lost some other guys here as well, brought in TJ Warren. Trading a first-round pick for Royce O'Neal right before Kevin Durant requested a trade was obviously an absolute disaster, and that is really where this grade comes down to, is when you have all the turmoil around Kevin Durant, I think it has to be an F offseason. Next up now is the Charlotte Hornets, who really didn't do anything. They drafted Mark Williams. Miles Bridges is no longer going to be a part of the team for obvious reasons, and ultimately they kind of just got significantly worse, not necessarily to any fault of their own, but not a great offseason for them, so I'm going to give them a C. Next up now is the Chicago Bulls, who I gave a C+ to because they didn't really do a ton here. I mean, they re-signed Zach LaVine, which obviously is important, but in terms of upgrading their team, not a lot of moves here for Chicago, and so ultimately I'm going to give them a C+. Another C+ here is the Cleveland Cavaliers. Pretty much a similar story. You know, they drafted a guy in the first round, should help them on the wing, but apart from that, not a whole lot happening in terms of significant moves for Cleveland. Speaking of significant moves, though, we have the Dallas Mavericks. Christian Wood was their biggest addition, Jalen Brunson being the biggest player that left for them. I didn't love the value in exchange for Christian Wood, and I thought that they maybe could have saved that for a different piece down the road, potentially Jeremy Grant, given what we saw Jeremy Grant go for. Christian Wood should be a fine addition for them. I don't know that he's going to help them a ton in the postseason, especially defensively, and losing Jalen Brunson certainly hurts, so I'm going to give them a C grade here. Next up now, though, is one of my favorite, most underrated off seasons of the entire league, and that is the Denver Nuggets. They traded for KCP, who I think is a perfect fit for what they need to do, especially in comparison to someone like Will Barton, who was never really a clean fit as a 3-and-D player alongside their stars on that roster. Losing Monty Morris hurts, but they have Bones Highland there to step up, and then bringing in Bruce Brown, I think is going to be absolutely perfect. When you have a passer as talented as Nikola Jokic, bringing in someone like Bruce Brown that is such a strong off-ball cutter, brings all the energy, can really guard for you, that's a fantastic addition for them. I'm going to give them an A offseason. Next up now is the Detroit Pistons. I gave them a B+. They brought in some veterans in different trades, but of course the biggest thing for them was drafting Jaden Ivey and Jalen Duren as well. They did trade away Jeremy Grant for a first-round pick. They did re-sign Marvin Bagley, but in terms of the value they got with a 5th pick, bringing in Jaden Ivey, the moves they made on draft night with Jalen Duren, I'm going to give them a B+ just because we don't really know what those guys are going to look like yet at the NBA level, but it was very clearly a positive offseason for Detroit. You can maybe even make the argument that this should be an A grade if you'd like. Next up now is the Golden State Warriors, who I'm going to give a C+ to. I like Dante DiVincenzo. Patrick Baldwin could be interesting, but of course when you're losing critical pieces of your championship team like Gary Payton and Otto Porter, you're going to get some negative grades from me. Re-signing Kevon Looney was important, but ultimately I'm going to give them a C+ offseason. Next up now is the Houston Rockets. They get a B+ for me. They finally get out of the John Wall thing. They get pretty good value in exchange for Christian Wood. And then of course, drafting Jabari Smith, Tari Eason, Ty Washington, each of which had interesting moments in the summer league. For me, that is a B+ offseason. Next up now is Indiana, who gets an A for their offseason because they finally decided on a clear path and a clear direction. They're getting future value. I like the Mathurin pick as well. I think that for them, getting the value they got in exchange for Malcolm Brogdon was fantastic, and maybe there are some more moves for them down the road as well. I'm going to give them an A grade. Next up now is a very simple one. It's the LA Clippers. I gave them a B+ because they brought in John Wall for basically nothing in terms of money, and then they lost Isaiah Hartenstein, but they re-signed Zubac, Robert Covington. This is going to be an incredibly deep team from top to bottom. So talented, and if they're healthy next year, like this is to me the underrated sleeper potential championship team for this upcoming season. If healthy, which is always a thing for them, but I'm going to give them a B+ offseason so far. Next up now is the other LA team, the Lakers. I gave them a C- because they brought in a clutch client, Lonnie Walker, with their one mid-level exception. Toscano Anderson could be interesting. Thomas Bryant could be interesting. Same thing with Damian Jones, Troy Brown. They lost Malik Monk. Ultimately, though, they're not significantly better in any way. They didn't use their mid-level exception well, in my opinion, so they're going to get a C-. Next up now is the Memphis Grizzlies. They're going to get a B- only because Kyle Anderson was important to them. DeAnthony Melton I liked. They got a first-round pick for him, and I understand why they did it, but I thought he was helpful for them. And then the rookies they brought in are just kind of TBD, right? Like David Roddy, Kenny Chandler, Jake Arabia. We're still kind of TBD on what their roles are going to be. I give them the benefit of the doubt because they're Memphis and they develop pretty much everybody into good NBA players. But for right now, I'm going to give them a B-. Next up now is the Miami Heat. They lost PJ Tucker. They brought in Nikola. I wrote Jokic on the document. It's Jovic, not Jokic. They brought him in. We'll see what he ends up becoming as a rookie, but I gave them pretty much just like an NAC grade here. They didn't really do a ton. Next up now is another team that I really like their offseason, and that is the Milwaukee Bucks. For two reasons. One, they re-signed Bobby Portis to a deal that I think really helps them. Losing Bobby Portis would have been a huge loss for them in free agency. And then I think Joe Ingles is a really important guy as well that can be brought in as like a complementary, kind of make all the pieces fit together piece. I gave them an A offseason. Next up, Minnesota. I think you might be able to tell where this one's going. I gave them a D grade for their offseason solely because of the Rudy Gobert trade. I've talked about it a ton. It was too much value in exchange for Rudy Gobert. You could talk about what that's going to do for them this season, how he's going to fit alongside Karl-Anthony Towns. You can talk about all that if you want to. It was too much in exchange for Rudy Gobert, and so they're going to get a D grade. Next up are the Pelicans. They get an A from me because I really like Dyson Daniels. I think as a two-way player, he's really intriguing on this roster. But then, of course, they re-signed Zion Williamson to the full max contract, which is a move that I've already talked about that I really like for them. It was a huge positive for them to just get that situation dealt with. And as long as they're good over the next couple of seasons, I think Zion, if he's healthy, is going to be a fantastic asset for them. And they've really kind of, for now, dealt with that situation, which was absolutely massive for them. Next up now is the New York Knicks. I'm going to give them a B-. They brought in Jalen Brunson. Everybody knows I'm not a huge fan of that contract. Hartenstein is interesting. They lose guys like Walker, Burks, Noel. They re-signed Mitchell Robinson on a deal that for me was a little bit rich, and I didn't love what they did on draft night, despite the fact that it gave them some extra picks. So I'm going to give them a B- for their offseason. Next up now is OKC. I gave them an A. They re-signed Lou Dort to a deal that in the long term might be a little expensive, but at least they have him locked up. And then I really like Chet. I think Jang's interesting. I think both Williamses are interesting. They absolutely, to me, nailed the draft in terms of moving up and down and getting guys that are going to help them. And all of them, in my opinion, looked really impressive in Summer League. So I'm going to give them an A grade. Next up now, speaking of the draft, is the Orlando Magic. I also gave them an A grade. I really like Paolo. Caleb Houston had moments in Summer League as well, and they didn't really lose anybody. They brought back guys like Mo Bamba to a really deep and interesting roster. So I gave them an A. Next up now is another one of my favorite underrated off seasons, and that is the Philadelphia 76ers. I gave them an A because PJ Tucker, Daniel House, and DeAnthony Melton are exactly the kind of players that this team needs. Guys that can guard, that can shoot, and can play around the James Harden, Joel Embiid, Tyrese Maxey, Tobias Harris ecosystem. They really struggled to find wings in the past that could play on both ends of the floor, and they brought in 3 of them in the same offseason and only lost out on Danny Green. Of course, re-signing James Harden to the low max, basically to a $15 million pay cut was huge for them as well. I gave them an A grade. Next up now is the Phoenix Suns, who didn't do a whole lot, but they did re-sign DeAndre Ayton. So for me, they're going to get a B despite the weirdness of the Ayton situation and the fact that it didn't really seem like they wanted to keep him. That is for a different day, so I gave them a B grade. Next up is Portland, who I really liked their offseason. Maybe it doesn't help them a ton in terms of like 5 years from now, but I gave them an A. I thought they got really good value in terms of what they gave up to get Jeremy Grant. Gary Payton's going to help them. Shaedon Sharpe is an interesting young player, and they re-signed Anthony Simons and Yusuf Nurkic in addition to the big name contract. But in terms of helping their team this upcoming season, this was a really good offseason for them, so I'm going to give them an A. Next up, another team that I thought did pretty well, surprisingly I would say, would be the Sacramento Kings. Brought in Malik Monk, who's going to provide them spacing, which they desperately needed, Kevin Huerter, who's going to provide them spacing, which they desperately needed, and Keegan Murray, who showed in Summer League that he's also going to provide them spacing, which they desperately needed. Lost out on a couple of role players, but I think ultimately the 3 guys that they brought in, those are significant upgrades and additions for them, so I gave them a B+. Next up now is San Antonio. I really considered giving them an A+ grade here. I ultimately went with an A. If you want to give them an A+, that's fine. I like Sohan. getting that much value in exchange for DeJounte Murray when it seemed like he wasn't really going to want to re-sign anyway is really, really good work from them. And so I gave them an A. Next up is Toronto. They get a B- just because it was kind of just like they didn't do much thing. Like they brought in Otto Porter, who I like, and so that bumped them up from a C to a B-. But apart from that, really no moves to speak of for Toronto. Next up now is the Utah Jazz, who are the only A+ of the entire video. If you told me going into the offseason that Utah was going to get the equivalent of 5 first-round picks in exchange for Rudy Gobert, I would have been mind blown. It's one of the best values considering player, position, age, and contract in league history in a trade. Maybe the best value ever that anyone's ever gotten. That is really, really good work from Utah. For me, they absolutely get an A+. And then last up is the Washington Wizards. I gave them a C. I'm being kind here because I feel like I've kind of talked about the Bradley Beal thing a lot. Trying to be a little bit kind to them because they did bring in, Johnny Davis, who could be interesting. Monty Morris is going to be a nice backup for them. But the Beal contract is obviously pretty egregious. I've talked about that multiple times. I don't think it needs to be revisited here, but those are my offseason grades for every single team in the league. Let me know down in the comment section below what grade you liked the most and which you disliked the most, and let me know what grades you would have given for every single team in the league. That is the end of the video. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.